Hello everyone, welcome to this very special college event. We're delighted to have you here. This is the first of the Vice-Chancellor's talks, and we're delighted to have with us this evening award-winning director, and we're proud to say RCA alumnus Asif Kapadia. In a moment, our Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Paul Thompson, will be opening the event with Asif, but before then, I've just got a few housekeeping points, and then I'll come back for the Q&A later in the session with our students. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on RCA channels after the event, and everyone who registered will get the link to the video once it's up. So if for any reason you have to leave us or you drop out for connection issues, you will still get a link to the video, so you'll be able to watch the webinar in full. We are not using the raise hand function, and we're not using the chat function today. But aside from that, our students will be coming up live, and Dr. Thompson and Asif will soon be talking. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Dr. Thompson, and I will see you later on in the event. Enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bryony. And yeah, I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to this evening's talk. It's a fine sunny evening here in London, and it's great to have so many of you on the call. I believe there are over 400 people, and they're coming in from 30 different countries. So it's a really global RCA community event. Asif is an RCA alumnus, as Bryony said. He also received an honorary doctorate from us in 2020. In fact, last February, seems an eternity ago now, particularly with the sun shining, pre-COVID. And that was in recognition of his contribution to documentary filmmaking, culture, and the arts. Ever since Asif graduated from film and television program in 1997 from the RCA, he's been picking up awards at a pretty relentless rate. He in fact, his first graduate film, The Sheep Thief, which is set in Rajasthan, won a prize at the Cannes Film Festival. So that's pretty good going, just straight a year, I think it is, or 2 years out of college. He's received a plethora of other awards, including multiple BAFTAs, and he holds an Oscar, of course, and a Grammy for Amy, the highest grossing documentary of all time in the UK. His body of work led the Financial Times to call him the director who reinvented the documentary. But it isn't just documentary making that Asif excels at. His body of work spans cinema and television, documentary and drama, including adverts, albeit cinematic, 3-minute long adverts, featuring the life of Thomas Burberry with a host of Hollywood A-listers and a virtual reality storytelling scenario. From the early fable of the sheep thief to the meticulous biographical detail of Amy Winehouse, Asif is rightly lauded as a great storyteller. He compels the audience to care about his subjects, while also sharing a truly nuanced portrait of those he chooses to document. His own background and the help he received through his educational career, including a bursary to study at the RCA, have led him to be a great advocate on behalf of disadvantaged and underrepresented groups, and he's lent his voice recently to the Black Lives Matter movement. Asif also talks about the need to use your wits, a skill he learned growing up as the youngest of 5 children, growing up in that Hackney that was very different from the Hackney of today. Asif, I suspect you set some pretty high bars for yourself in life, not least when you say that taking an MA at the RCA is all about testing yourself. Oh. Senna, the story of Brazilian Formula One champion Ayrton Senna, was the first documentary to be released in the now acclaimed unintentional trilogy of films, Senna, Amy, and Diego Maradona. And they're all telling a cautionary tale on the pitfalls of fame and glory. The most recent, Diego Maradona, looks at the career of one of the most talented football players of all time, who polarizes opinion across generations and the world. I watched it again last night and was struck by the fatalistic sense of a downfall. It's a chronicle of a death foretold, except there is no death at the end of it. It's not dissimilar to a Greek tragedy that you managed to capture. There's a sense that we're watching a figure whose hubris or tragic flaw is going to bring him down in the end. The bifurcation between Diego, the child prodigy from the slums, and Maradona, the larger-than-life superstar in a mink coat, wrestle within an individual until ultimately the external forces which have created the Maradona prevail. Can we talk a little bit about your career and how you feel it has been impacted by your time at the RCA?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. Really happy and proud to be here, by the way. So looking forward to this. How can the RCA was really important for me. I was there from 1995 to 1997. Before I went to the RCA, I had been working in the film industry for quite a while, quite a few years. I'd already done an undergraduate degree. I was working in television. I was directing for TV. So I had like a job. I had a career.
Right.
But what I felt was at the time, I was just sort of doing work because I was lucky enough to be in that situation, but I wasn't really doing anything creative that I felt was satisfying. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a style. I didn't know who I was as an artist or as a filmmaker. So I ended up quitting my job and applying to go to the RCA in order to spend 2 years doing an MA to find myself in a way and to test myself and to specifically work on a certain style. And what was interesting in those days, you know, and I suppose it's the same for certain art schools, you're not necessarily taught every minute of the day. It's not like doing a degree. You are a grown up, and the idea was to kind of say, create your own course, create your own work in those days. And my idea was to make cinema, to make cinematic films. So I spent 2 years making films which had very little dialogue. And the reason was, in TV, all I was doing was shooting interviews, and essentially had very little time, and I just had to make it up as I was going along. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do was go away and say, how do I tell the story with pictures to make something universal that works for audiences, no matter which language you speak? And that cinematic style is actually the kind of fingerprint that runs through all of the work that came after the RCA.
But how do you make something cinematic when it's essentially in the documentary form, where it's essentially made up of old clips and very often family movie clips? How do you turn that into something cinematic?
I mean, what I always tried to do when I was at university, when I was at the RCA, and when I started making Senna, which was the first of my kind of documentaries, the idea was always to say, how can I do this in an original way? What can I do that makes this unique to me? What is it that I can bring to it? And so the first of the documentaries was Senna. Now, typically, how did you shoot a documentary? The style at the time, and we're talking about in the mid 2000s, probably 2003, 4, 5, that project started. Yeah. You know, and not just typically, this is how it was budgeted. The idea was there was 40-minute money to shoot 40 minutes of interviews, talking head interviews, 40 minutes of archive, and 10 minutes of miscellaneous. And that's essentially what I signed up for. And I think the job of the artist or the job of the film director is to say, even though that's what I signed up for, I think there's a better way. There's a more interesting way. There's a more creative way. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the easiest way, but I think there's something here that is more interesting. And in my case, I thought it was more cinematic to do it without the interviews. Not have people talking on camera saying, well, Ayrton Senna, he was great. And he was the fastest. And then you cut to a shot with someone going, meow. It's boring. You know, for me, that was like, now that's kind of what people expected at the time from documentaries. Yeah. So my job was to say, no matter how many people said I was wrong, really experienced people kept saying, no, this is how it's done. And they could honestly turn to me and say, you've not even made a documentary before. And I go, I haven't, but I'm making this one. And I'm directing this one, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And then I had to get everyone on board one by one. And I think that's the job of the artist. You may not be doing what everyone else is doing, but that's why what you do has your name on it, and that's why you're unique. And hopefully you can then pay off by producing the work.
I mean, one thing that strikes me particularly with Senna is you really lead with the visual. And is that unusual? I'm guessing it is quite unusual in a documentary. You don't normally get that visual and also the soundtrack that you put against the visual. I mean, not Senna. I was actually then thinking right from the beginning of Maradona, where you've got
the music,
pumping music. It's absolutely hypnotic.
So I think that comes from, you know, at the RCA I was doing drama. I was making fiction films which had very little dialogue. So the idea is, how can you tell a story where people are not talking? Well, you have to tell the story in the cut. So Hitchcock is a big reference, or lots of kind of French cinema, or kind of, because I've studied the kind of history of cinema, I'm coming from a background of having watched Italian neorealism or French movies or Chinese cinema, and thinking, well, you tell the story in the edit, you tell the story through two images that when you cut them together, move the story forward. So the idea was to take that principle into my feature films, which I made before I made Senna. And then when I got to making Senna, again, the idea is the easier thing is to interview somebody, start with an interview, have the audio, have the pictures, and you cut around that. What I ended up doing was doing it the other way around, which was to start with the pictures. How much of the story can I tell purely out of archive? And then say, well, what do I need somebody to say? I will do interviews, but I won't show them because, number one, I can't interview Ayrton Senna, and this is his story. It's from his point of view. Yeah. And I don't want it to become from the point of view of everybody else. And then the other thing is, well, if he's not alive, I need to make the audience believe he's alive again. So this is a really key principle. The idea of a lot of documentaries is you're looking back in time and you cut backwards and then you kind of show something. And my principle is always tell the story in the present. You want it to feel like it's happening now. You want us to, I don't want you to think of it as this is a story from 20 years ago when Amy Winehouse, you know, might have been alive. Or the idea, I've got some loud neighbors. The idea was to make it seem like we were there with Senna in the car at the time, and actually to forget what happens at the ending. Same with Amy, tell the story in the present. There may be some foreshadowing, but essentially the idea, and with fiction films, that's what you're trying to do. You don't make fiction films always saying, well, this happened in the past, and I'm going to keep reminding you of that. So I'm essentially was taking some of the rules that I learnt while making drama and put them and applied them to documentary.
But it's very, very helpful and very insightful to hear that. But were you worried when you started to work on Senna, or when you selected Senna, thinking, gosh, people know this story. They know about the superstar. They know about, you know, Alain Prost. They know about the rivalry, the jealousy. They know about the death at the end, which is unbelievably, movingly captured in your film. But were you worried? How do I make this different from what people have already read?
So I think that's a really, really good question, because essentially you're dealing with two groups of people: those that know, who are into the subject. And just as importantly, if not more importantly, people who don't know, and people who are not into the subject, people who don't like sport, people who don't like Formula One, people who have no interest. The most boring thing in the world is people going round and round in circles at 200 miles per hour.
Oh, there is. There's something worse. It's called football.
We'll come to that. So the idea was to almost make the film, it has to work for the people who have no interest. Yeah. And the people who are interested, they'll come. If you do it in an interesting way, if you show them material they've never seen before, you've got that audience. The challenge for me is to cross over to the people who think it's really boring. So a lot of it is about reduction, of taking away, in Senna's case, removing a lot of the technical elements, not worrying about engines, not worrying about tires, things that people who are into Formula One are really obsessed with. But actually, I wanted to simplify it almost to a level of blue car bad, red car good, right? And that's like, you know, you should be able to understand on a really simplistic level. If you know, there's a lot more going on. But if you don't know, there's a way for anyone to understand that rather than having 10 drivers fighting over a championship, it really is reduced down to two: Alain Prost and Senna, who are opposites, who end up in the same team, who don't like each other. And that becomes much more like a boxing match, which is what the idea was, to kind of reduce it down to essentials. And then you can have fun with the reality of the story, as it was so complex that whenever we were working on it, we kept thinking, you know, if you wrote it, no one would believe you, the things that happened.
Absolutely.
And there's a really key thing, actually, Paul, which I would say to the students, which is to do with, sometimes ideas come out of misfortune. They come out when things go wrong. And a lot of the films that I've made, something will always go wrong. Massively will happen. Right now, you know, we're in the middle of COVID and people are trying to make work or create. Excuse me, on Senna, it took a long time for the contracts to get done. It took a long time for us to officially start on a project. That period of time meant I couldn't hire an editor. I couldn't hire anyone else. I wasn't being paid. it was nearly 9 months of being on that project while we were waiting for the deals to happen between the Senna family, Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone, Universal Pictures, the producers, working title. You know, there were a lot of people fighting over the contracts. So in that period of time, all I could do was look at clips off YouTube. I didn't have anyone that I couldn't interview anyone. I couldn't shoot anyone. That moment at the time was really difficult and challenging because I wasn't getting paid. I was struggling to pay the bills. But that's the moment that essentially made that film, because that's when I realized I can tell the story with this footage that I'm seeing. I don't need interviews. So that moment where things go wrong, where you don't have the money, you don't have the time, you can't do something, is thinking time, which is really key. And actually that made that film, and that made Amy, and that made Maradona. That kind of made me switch careers almost. You know, that thinking time is what everything that comes after it is because of that. And so I think that's a really important thing. And it happens in every movie, and it happens all the time on creative projects where things go wrong. And then your job as the kind of lead creative is to figure out, well, how am I going to find a solution that actually makes a virtue of whatever's happened?
God, yeah, incredible. I mean, I think most people would not have your nerve to steel, though, I have to say. But how are you coping creatively with COVID? I mean, what are the kind of opportunities, and what are the kind of real
I think
no-go, can't move position?
I'm kind of, I guess, honestly, we're quite lucky. You know, we have a home, we have 2 kids, we have my wife and I are here, we're at home, we have a garden. So the challenge is homeschooling is challenging, trying to carry on with work while trying to keep up with school and everything that comes with it. But, you know, generally the weather in the UK has been good. So that's made it kind of more bearable. I'm lucky, I guess, because last year, my last film, Diego Maradona, came out last year. It premiered at Cannes. It was released around the world. I traveled with it around the world. And this year is my setting up the next series of projects and resetting in terms of business and other ideas and writing. So I'm kind of lucky that it's transpired that I'm essentially locked down while I'm thinking and creating. And I can do quite a lot on my iPad and via email and WhatsApp. And generally a lot of the work is done that way now anyway, because if you're doing something in Argentina or in Italy or in Brazil or somewhere, you're not always traveling. You are basically sending messages, and you've got to get across what you want to do through a text message, because a lot of the work is across time zones. So it's kind of carried on as per normal, if not more busy almost, because what I don't have is the travel bit in between. I'm quite happy not to be flying. I'm quite happy not to be going anywhere. And it's been a really interesting period. And if anything, we've been on the lucky side of it. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of the kind of COVID crisis, in terms of the kind of, I guess, the tipping point that happened with the murder of George Floyd, in terms of the mess that we face and against a kind of a reducing timescale with kind of Brexit negotiations. Is it true that you're thinking of a political documentary? And if so, what angle would you take, do you think?
I am. And do you know, this could be something that at some point I might even come back to you, because I've got an idea that I'm just trying to set up, which is about, you know, I've been thinking about it for a while. I've been thinking about it because of Brexit, because of Trump. I was here during the kind of Brexit, the referendum. And I remember talking to somebody in the background in the Labour Party. It was the first person who said to me that Leave are going to win. And I remember this was before the referendum, and I was like really shocked. You know, I'm in the bubble of North London, I'm here, and everyone I know seemed to be Remain. And they were like, no, it's going really badly, the campaign, and actually Leave are going to win. And I remember someone saying that, and then I started looking at what was happening. This is 3 years ago, and thinking, oh my God, I can now realize that the minute I leave London, all I'm seeing are kind of pro-Brexit signs. I then went off to do a TV show in America for Netflix from David Fincher called Mindhunter. So I was then in the US during the US elections.
Wow.
And because my family were here, I was there working in prep or shooting in Pittsburgh, which was a swing state. And I was just watching the news and going, oh my God, the language is identical to what we've just heard at Brexit. It's literally like they've cut and pasted the words and the terms. And then I started noticing people in the background going, you know, what's Nigel Farage doing there? What's he got to do with Donald Trump? And you realize Steve Bannon and all these people were popping up in both places long before I read it in The Guardian that there was a connection between all of this. So I remember just thinking there's something up. And I kept saying to my friends in America, I think Trump's going to win. I've got an awful feeling. We've just had it over there. And of course he does. And I was there shooting the day after he won. I was still shooting, and you know, I remember that mood. So that kind of, anyway, all of that has been in my mind for a while, and just trying to connect the dots between what's been going on, how technology is used. So I am kind of trying to put together a project, but it's not just looking at what's happening now. It's kind of looking at the patterns of how this has happened in the past, and what kind of tricks are essentially, you know, the far right of fascists using in order to kind of win again and run again and again. And why is it they keep doing it? Why are they successful? So there is a kind of large scale project. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to do it in such a way, it's not going to be a classic biography like Senna, Amy and Maradona. Right. It's kind of on a different scale and playing with time in a different way.
Right.
I would like to kind of almost get a team of creatives together. Like you have writers' rooms on TV series. I want to kind of try to get a room of creatives together that could then work. And how do we visualize different moments in time? How do we visualize things that have happened and find connection? So at some point I might come back to you and just see whether or not there are some students or ex-students from the RCA who might be interested in collaborating.
I'm sure there will be many, many, many who would. And I think, we look forward to your take on the kind of how nationalism and versus globalism and, you know, strong men of politics all plays out, because it is remarkably unoriginal, as you say, the kind of the fascism. I mean, it's back to the 1930s with fear of the other, and it's incredible that it's still got a shelf life. Absolutely incredible. Talking about you being in the States and Mindhunter, I mean, there you, to my understanding, it was a Netflix commissioned project. You only wrote and directed certain of the episodes.
I directed 2 episodes, So I worked with writers to tweak the episodes in the writing, but essentially I was just a director.
How different is that from directing your own, for want of a better word, baby, like Senna or Amy?
I mean, it is very different, but it's actually also fun, because one of the things about making films like Senna and Amy and Maradona is that, you know, essentially a lot of the work is post-production. A lot of the work is editing and being, you know, in a room, actually. And the fun part of filmmaking is going out and shooting. So the great thing was to just go out and shoot and direct on set with actors and a crew. And generally US crews are amazing. And working with David Fincher was a really fantastic experience. So I was making that at the same time as Amy. Or was it Maradona? Sorry, it's at the same time as Maradona. So at the beginning of Maradona, while that was being researched, I was going off to Pittsburgh to shoot. And I often had, you know, you end up having to make more than one thing at a time. So if there's a period of time when just research is happening, I don't need to be there every single day. So I would go off and try and do some drama. And then I'll come back and almost see the world in fresh eyes. Is useful occasionally to do that.
Senna, Amy and Maradona, and probably Madonna too. I think they're all, as individuals, and particularly in the films that you've made, they provoke really kind of violent swings between kind of crowd adulation and mob vilification. And what is it, do you think, about modern society that makes what are probably pretty unhealthy tendencies anyway, it fluctuates so violently between the sort of the adulation and then the vilification? I'm just thinking of that scene, you know, of Maradona in the Naples, you know, the famous, you know, shootout, kick
penalty.
Penalty, that's the word. You can sort of understand how it turns to hatred and vilification there, but the same thing happens in Senna and Amy's life. What is it that's playing out there, do you think?
I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I guess, one of the key things about making these films is, why do you pick certain subjects? And the reason that I'm interested in these films and these subjects is because for me, if you're making a film, you need drama, you need characters, you need charisma, you need something that they're trying to achieve, or something that's stopping them. What's not very interesting are people who are essentially boring. Nothing happens, you know, people who were just great, and they were great and they did really great things and everyone loved them. And you're like, well, who cares? You know, why would I want to make a film about that person? That's part of it, is that you want what you've just said. You want people to hate them. They're more interesting in a way if people hate them, because you've got somewhere to go. You say, why do people hate them? What did they do? What was so awful? And it's quite easy in football and sport for people to get really carried away with themselves and love one person and hate one person. And if that person leaves, you then hate them, or if they're playing against you, you know, you can't help yourself. Sport is like that anyway. But then with Amy, there was something slightly different where, you know, let's be honest, she wasn't particularly universally loved when she was alive. She wasn't particularly, because everyone was being sold a certain message by the media, by the tabloids, by the press, saying, you know, this woman is awful drunk, and look at her state of her, and the worst possible pictures of her would end up on every front page of every tabloid, and people, even though they may think they don't read them or watch them, were clicking on those websites. So that idea of going back and saying, well, how did that happen? How is it that someone so young can die and no one seemed surprised or shocked by it or cared? That was a big part of Amy. With Maradona, it was a challenge because he really does divide people, you know, and so and he has had a very long life. So with him, the challenge was, well, it's almost impossible to tell everything. And he also did a lot of awful things that I don't want to justify. I don't want to try and explain. So that's a big part of the reason why with Maradona, we chose a specific moment in his life, which is where I feel he changes from Diego to Maradona. And everything that comes afterwards is because of what happened in Naples. And the person he is when he arrives in Naples is because of everything that happened before. But it was just to focus on a contained period of time, which not many people know about, not many people have seen the material or the footage. So it's a series of questions that come into it. You want people with drama, you want people that have events that have happened, dramatic events that have happened in their life. Then the idea is, well, how are you going to show it in a cinematic way? What are you going to see or feel? What do you want the audience to feel? With Amy, it was really like important that at a certain point, we turn the kind of lens around at the audience and say, you're involved, you're complicit, you're a part of this. I felt really angry and terrible and awful and sad when I was making it and watching all the material and hearing all the stories. And I remember thinking, I want the audience to feel like I'm feeling. This is not going to be a comfortable film. I don't want you to come out smiling and think everything was great. Oh, it's a shame. No, there were lots of opportunities when someone could have helped her and saved her. And I want the audience to feel guilt at times, to realize, what do I do? What have I done? Not just with her, but with other people who become famous. They're young, they're given everything. And then you know what? They act stupidly because no one's looking after them and protecting them. And then it's their fault. But they're 21 years old or 22 years old. So that was a big part of the film. And I wasn't not sure how it was going to work for an audience. I always thought that, you know, we might, you know, Senna in a way is almost like a saint at times. He does some awful things and people didn't like him. But generally, he's quite a positive character. And essentially stood up for good things, was very, very eloquent, really good way of speaking, and a very intelligent man. But he also took it so seriously that he was willing to crash into someone on purpose at 200 miles an hour, you know, to stop the other guy winning because he felt he'd been done wrong. So there's all of these kind of complexities. The more complex the character, potentially, the more interesting the film.
And of course, money always helps in the mix. In terms of kind of, you know, money and corporatism, they kind of play a part in all of the downfalls, don't they? And I just wondered whether your films are they old-fashioned morality tales, or are they a contemporary indictment of modern capitalism?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, a bit of everything. I am really interested in classical stories and classical folk tales and myths and legends. And then the idea, if you can almost apply that idea, the way you explained, you know, the way you set up the Maradona story, you know, certain people will see that. They'll see like a Greek myth or, you know, they're kind of all warriors in a way. Someone described to me, my first feature film was called The Warrior. And somebody who saw kind of Senna, Amy and Maradona said they're all modern day warriors in a way who then go out to battle and who suffer. You know, because they rise to a certain place and then you can't stay there forever, and everyone around you or someone's going to bring you down eventually, or fame will bring you down, or hubris, or, you know, whatever it is will kind of hit you at some way. And I think that idea of having a kind of classical story in the back of your head, or understanding how stories work. And if you understand how stories work, and that comes from writing fiction films, what I've tried to do with my team and my editor is to essentially tell fiction films which are written using archive, and all writing and all stories go back to kind of classical myths and fairy tales and things like that. So if you understand how they work, what I'm trying to do is apply those sort of acts and structures and subplots and anti-heroes within a form where I haven't got out and shot it. So they are written, they are created, and if somebody else was given the footage of all of Amy's material or all of Senna's material or all of Maradona's story. They would make a very different film. So one of the key things is these films are essentially telling stories that I'm interested in. It's what I see in these characters and what I see with my editor and what I see with my team. And it's not necessarily what somebody else would see. But the hope is by doing our research and talking to everyone that matters and by really forensically going into detail in their story, in their backstory, in their characters and why things happened, hopefully the films become the definitive version of those character stories. Because you said at the beginning, Paul, there are lots of films that have already been made about Senna, about Amy, and about Maradona. So the challenge is, what is different about these films? Well, hopefully we've got the people who were there talking. If we couldn't meet them ourselves, I met with Maradona and interviewed him quite a few times. But then also we're looking for a way to explain the story and their journey without focusing on just one small thing. We're trying to tell the big picture. That's always the intention.
Well, I thank you so much. I've hogged the mic for far too long. There are a load of people out there who want to ask lots of questions of you. So I'm going to bow out. Brian's going to come back in again. And thank you so much. Just some thoughts. Very, very stimulating. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. And thanks to you, Asif, as well. That was incredibly interesting. And I think some of the points that you raised about the Amy film, particularly, I too am in the North London bubble, and I think that people around here, because of where she was from and everything, felt it quite hard, but it keeps happening, doesn't it? We had the Caroline Flack stuff recently, and it's so sad. But yeah, I think
Meghan Markle is a recent one.
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting, and it's really upsetting that it continues to happen. But
generally women, generally blokes doing it to women. J.K. Rowling is another one. But anyway,
recently. But it shows the emotive power of the subjects that you're touching on. So for me, you definitely got the reaction that you intended. I felt bad and I felt sad as well, but I was really glad I watched it. But less about me. Let's move on to the students who are all incredibly keen to talk to you. I'm very happy to introduce Monica. She's our first student. She's from the US, but she's currently here in the UK. And she's an innovation design engineering student. She's focusing on design products and services based on human interactions with a targeted interest in music, beauty, and computer software industries. Over to you, Monica.
Hi, Asif. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. So my question is your creative vision set at the start of a project, or does it develop with time and research?
Thank you for the question. Great question. I would say it's definitely not set. I think there may be certain kind of tricks that I know that I can rely on, but generally it comes out of the project. And because I try to do a very diverse range of projects, fiction, documentary, shorts, features, each one will have a different set of criteria rules. But what I do is when I start making it, one of the things I try to do generally, is when you're talking to money people or producers or the people around you, they want you to know everything because you're the director. You should know it all. And I'm pretty good at just saying, I don't know. What do you think? There is a time and a place to just say, I don't know, I'll figure that out. Right now, this is what I think it's going to be. But I'm very good at being able to then change my mind. And the reason I ended up really swinging more towards documentaries is that I have a bit more freedom to change my mind during the process, to go with where the story takes me and not to have a set thing. I think that can be dangerous, to have a very set idea and everything has to squeeze into your idea, as opposed to saying, well, there's all this material that I found, the idea is expanded, and I just interviewed somebody and they've taken it in a totally different way. And I like the freedom to go where it goes and where it takes me, and for it to be a much more organic process, I would say.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, I would finish that question off by saying one other thing, which is I always try to have an end point in mind. I have an idea of where I want it to go. And often it does end up there, but it will just go via a very different route.
Has it ever not ended up there?
I mean, look, we've all I've definitely made films which haven't been successful. They're not all hits. I think you just learn. You learn on the way. That is a part of being kind of creative. Not everything succeeds. Not everything is a massive. But what you mustn't do is ever let that stop you doing the next one and the next one.
Sure. You're with me for this next one. Unfortunately, the student couldn't attend tonight, but they submitted a great question. So this is from Alistair, who's on our sculpture programme. And he said, I was impressed at the ambition and the scale of Sheep Thief. Do you have any tips to current students on realising large projects?
Yeah, I mean, so The Sheep Thief was my graduation film from the RCA. And, you know, at the time I was thinking, okay, I've been a student for quite a few years, and this is my MA, it's the final project I'm going to do on my MA, my last piece of work as a student. And I had three different ideas I remember that I was working on. One was a kind of complicated project, one was a straight sort of simple project, and one was a crazy project. And typically the idea was, I'm not even going to tell anyone about the safe one or the medium one. I'm just going to mention the hard one and the difficult one. And the more I talked about it, the kind of more complicated it began. And actually to the point where a lot of the film school at the RCA, the tutors there didn't think it was possible to make. I have to be honest, some of my own fellow students who were working on it thought it was going to be impossible to do, because my idea was to go off and shoot a film in the desert in India with street kids. So there were no professional actors. We were going to go there, take the crew and be in the middle of nowhere and shoot this film, and on film. This is back in the day when we shot on 16mm. It wasn't on video camera. So we had to carry the film over, process it in Bombay, and then bring it back to London. We had to raise quite a lot of money. This film, The Sheep Thief, cost £25,000 in 1997. So it was 30 minutes long, 25 minutes long, I think it was. So it was quite a long short, but I thought, okay, this is my final step, I hope, before I make feature films. So yeah, we all went a bit crazy. I would say I probably had the closest to having a nervous breakdown. A lot of people quit. It was an absolute nightmare, but my point is, you should be pushing yourself when you're a student. You should always be aiming for something you've never done before. It should be impossible. It should be something where you stretch yourself and you stretch your team to the ultimate, because you're safe, you're a student, right? If you fail, that's the point, I think, of being a student. Once you go out into business and you go out into the real world, you're not allowed to fail. So if you don't experiment when you're a student, when are you going to do it? And I think that film was so challenging, so difficult, but it was also the film that kind of got me an agent. It got me some money to write. It started my career. Really, The Sheep Thief was the beginning. We went to a lot of festivals around the world. It won a lot of prizes. It won a prize at Cannes. But really, that would not have happened if I hadn't pushed myself to way beyond my experience. And I would still say, even now, that The Sheep Thief is probably one of, if not the most difficult film I've ever made.
Really, a true labour of love.
But it still gets shown. It's still out there. A lot of film schools and universities around the world kind of screen it. It's available on the BFI website for free if you're in the BFI Player website, if you're in the UK. So if anyone wants to see it. But yeah, it was the challenge. I like that challenge. I think that's really important. What I found on that film, half the crew, when we were in the middle of nowhere in India, quit. They just couldn't deal with it. It's too hard for them. The people who stuck with it, I still work with today. One of the people who I stuck with, who's my production designer from the RCA, I'm married to, and we have 2 children. So, you know, that film was the one that kind of made us and broke a lot of us, unfortunately.
Yeah, she really stuck with it for the long haul. I was going to say, from the crew aside, but the people that you had to raise funds from and that you got involved otherwise, have you worked with a lot of those people since? Was this a relationship?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's a big part of being a filmmaker is being able to sell the idea, sell the project, and raise money. Mm-hmm. So again, I think it's really important when you're a student, and even at my undergraduate course, we were always trying to raise money. If the college gave us 500 quid, we would raise another 500 quid. So we had 1,000. If the college gave you 5 grand, we raised another 5 grand. You know, that was part of the mentality to say, well, I could do it with that amount, but I'm going to push it further and see. And that technique of being able to sell your idea, sell your project. When you're a student, you can ask anyone for anything, and you should. You know, you can essentially get away with it because you're a student. And I was quite good at that. And so we raised the money by just, you know, people liked the idea, they liked the script. Before I came to the RCA, I worked in a TV company. I actually went back to my old boss. I quit that job to go to the RCA. I went back to my old boss and asked him for some money to make the film. And he gave me some money out of his own pocket. And the editors that I worked with gave some money. And I did a commercial, and that won a prize of film stock. So we basically found bits and pieces. I think the college gave us 7 grand, and we raised the other 18 ourselves.
Wow. Okay. Shows the importance of connections.
I'll tell you another thing, actually, really important. You know, the college, the RCA just didn't think they trusted us, so they wouldn't give us any equipment. This is the key part of it. They wouldn't give us any equipment. We got the film camera and we got the film stock ourselves, but they wouldn't give us any lighting, any other equipment, because they just didn't think it would be safe going to India. So we were in the middle of nowhere in Rajasthan, and my cameraman, I remember going to a market with a piece of paper and a pen, and he drew a crane on a piece of paper and showed it to a blacksmith who didn't speak any English, and the blacksmith made us a crane. And we built, basically in Rajasthan, we built all of our own equipment, and at the end of the film gave it away to the local Indian crew.
That is amazing. Wow, what a piece of history to have as well.
It was a great experience. Yeah.
Moving on now to the next student. This is Kirsty, who's coming up now, based in the UK. She's doing a PhD in visual communication, and she combines analog Super 8 and 35mm photography, focusing in the areas of Los Angeles and Northern Europe, and her work is rooted in skateboard culture. Hi, Kirsty.
Great.
Over to you. You're muted at the minute, Kirsty.
Sorry, thanks for that.
Perils of Zoom.
I know, we're all getting used to it. Really love the conversation so far. I honestly feel like all the questions I wanted to ask have actually been answered. But I suppose the big one for me is obviously working in analog, as you were just describing, it's such an expensive way to work. But I also find it really tacit working in that kind of genre of filmmaking. So when it comes to the editing process, there's not a lot to kind of edit with. So I was just really interested in your motivation behind the actual editing process itself. And then really the second question is about kind of the satisfaction at the end of each film of, are you happy with what's kind of on the cutting room floor that has been left out? Or are there moments when you've really kind of looked back and thought, I wish actually now I'd put that in?
Really good questions. I mean, it's very important. The analog thing is a really key thing, because I'm of a certain generation, okay? I am of the generation that started shooting on film, editing on film, and projecting on film. And when I was working my way up, that's how all films were made. And then I've crossed over into the digital, non-linear, Avid, you know, I tell you, like, my first short film I actually shot on VHS, I think it was, and then U-matic, but everything was cut linear. You know, there was no non-linear, there's no Avid. You had to start at the beginning, and if you wanted to change the beginning, you had to go back and start all over again and do it in order. So that was my background. The key thing about that, which I think is great, which I think is really important, is you have to think before you do anything. You have to think before you turn over and turn the camera on. You have to think before you make an edit. And I think that is something that I think is really key, particularly before you've got, you know, untold amounts of money and budget. The planning part is key. What's happened, I find when I teach at a lot of film schools, is that if you're used to shooting on a phone or digitally, where you have an endless amount of hard drives and data, you just shoot everything, but with no plan or intention. And then in the edit, you're trying to make it all up and make it work. And everything I like to do is to think before I shoot. Even if I'm doing something using archive, why are we doing this? What is the intention? What is the story? So that even though there may not be literally a script, there is always a plan, a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is an arc, there is a journey, and I'm trying to find the key dramatic points of the story. So I think having a training in shooting analog and shooting on film, I think it's brilliant. Visually, it's always much nicer, but there's something about the planning that it's precious, which I think is very important. Which I think carries over into the work, because every cut matters, every shot matters. The sound of the camera go, brrr, your money is being burnt, in, you know, you can hear it being burnt away. I think that gives you tension, which I think you need when you're creating, because you need to know this is important. Am I sure before I turn over? I mean, I take Polaroid, I still shoot Super 8 as well. And you really think in a different way to click, 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 click on your phone. The second part of it, of kind of, I'm pretty good at working really, really, really hard on a film for a long time. And then when it's over, I'm done with it. Very rarely have I ever wanted to go back. I'm sure I've made loads of mistakes. Partly, I think I've got kind of short-term memory. So I just forget everything about the previous project when I move on to the next one. And I have not really ever gone into this habit of saying, oh, I wish I put that scene in. There is a DVD extras. You know, you can put extra material when you release a film. You can always add a little bit more material, or I do a cheeky thing on every film. I put them in the end credits, you know, I always have pictures in the end credits of some of my favorite shots that didn't make the film. So there'll be some shots of Amy, there'll be some shots of Senna or Maradona that didn't quite make it. But generally, I think it's a healthy thing to just say, that one's done, move on to the next one. Good luck.
Thank you very much for that one. Thank you, Kirsty. The next one is actually, there's going to be 4 of us on screen. These 2 students both submitted fantastic questions. There's a similar theme on them. So we'll welcome them both up, and then Yishan will go first and Zik will go second. So Yishan is in innovation design engineering. She's also a freelance illustrator. And Zik is from Singapore originally. He's studying global innovation design, and he's the founder of Design Says Hello, a movement advocating design as a catalyst for social change. So Yishan, do you want to say your question first for Asif, and then followed by you, Zik?
Yes, hi. Thanks for sharing, and your insights are so inspiring. And actually, my question starts with reading the comments of your movie, and I found something really fascinating, because people there, instead of like judging the movie itself, they start to discuss about the figure, about their life, their music, and I just find your movie opens like a door for others to know about those legendary figures in a magical way. So my question is, how do you balance the technical aspect with the sincerity of telling a good story?
Good question. So should I answer that one first? Yeah. It's really interesting because the technical thing, the story, the technical aspects, the balance between you're dealing with real people, real emotions, particularly if people have died or, you know, family are involved, you know, it's very complex. And so filmmaking is to do with politics, it's emotions, it's money, and it's kind of like, where are you coming from? What are you trying to say? Why is this important for you to make? What is it you're feeling? And I think all of that becomes a part of it. And so for me, finding some sort of truth and something that I believe in that's important to me is in every film. The technical thing is something that comes more instinctively because I've been making films for a long time. That the technical thing is something that you just learn and you pick up and you know the tricks and then you carry them over. It's really important you hire and work with really good people who you can delegate technical aspects to. So if you're lucky, you're making a film, you know, I have a brilliant editor, I have a brilliant composer, I have a person who's really good at doing the technical kind of stuff of the colorizing of images. Nothing that you see on the screen is the way we found it. There's a lot of work that goes in post-production to make everything work the way we want it to work. So a lot of that manipulation is designed, you know. What I would say is that in documentaries, you know, there isn't anything that is truthful. Everything is constructed. We cheat and lie to create truth. And so what we do is you do your homework and you do your research and then you say, this is what I think is the truth, but it doesn't suddenly just arrive. So that's where the technical part of it comes in. How can I make you think, I just found that shot and I just joined it together and it was really there. It's actually a lot of manipulation that has to go into it. A lot of visual effects go into it as well. I don't know if that makes it. And then the key thing is I show the films to the people that I've interviewed and that I've talked to before I release the film. Because the people I kind of trust and the people who I feel like are the most honest are the ones that I don't want to take advantage of them, because a lot of the films are made out of the relationships that I build up with these people. So I think that's a big part of it, is to have the relationship and then to say to them, if you trust me and open up and tell me about your life, and particularly remember someone's died generally or something awful's happened. If you trust me, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to show you the film. And if there's something you're unhappy with, I would rather hear it. If I've got something wrong, I want to hear it. So a lot of that fact checking has to happen as well to make sure I haven't misunderstood something. Often you'll have 3-4 people with different opinions, a bit like, you know, Rashomon or Kurosawa film or something. So you've got to then work out which version of this truth am I going with. That's all part of the process. And in the end, the idea is to leave it open for the audience to make their own choice. So that's why what you're saying about the comments is interesting. I'm kind of putting it out there, and then different people will see different things when they watch the movies. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, Zeke, do you want to go now?
Yeah, hello Asif, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Well, I've got a question for you, and it's really about, so in this information age and data-driven world that we live in today, from your perspective, how important is storytelling in this context?
I think storytelling is always going to be important. You know, no matter where we are in time, without stories, what is there? It's just like, even everything, social media is about telling a story. You know, writing a WhatsApp message has a story to it, or you know how it's going to, things will have a beginning, middle and end always, not necessarily in that order. But I think for me, storytelling and understanding stories, and for example, if you see a film and you know the film is an adaptation, reading the book and understanding, oh, right, they used that bit in the film, but they didn't use that bit, or they conflated these characters, or they changed the ending, and understanding how music works and how music can tell the story, or sound can tell the story. You know, everything is a story. You just have lots of layers. Visually, how do you tell the story? How do you tell the story with dialogue? So I'm interested in stories. I'm interested in you know, whether you're on a bus and you hear something, oh, that's quite interesting, and jotting it down into your notebook so that one day that might come in handy. If you're interested in characters and humans, then I think you're interested in stories. And if you're interested in people, then there's always, you want to listen to people. I think I'm interested in humans and people and listening. And then I'm generally kind of interested in kind of the humanity of people. So with all of the films, the documentaries particularly, the aim is always to say, let's try and get to the heart of this person and understand them better. And hopefully at the ending, the audience think about people differently. You know, with Amy or with Senna or with Maradona, you may think Maradona's an awful person. He's an idiot. He's a drug addict. He's done terrible things. But if you meet him before he became famous, he was quite different. And I think that's often it. There is a turning point. You know, people like him who came from like a favela, who had no money, family of 7 or 8 of them living in one shack with no running water, no electricity, to suddenly be that famous when you're 22. You know, the fact that he's alive is a miracle. The fact that he survived is amazing, because I don't know if anyone else would have, you know. So I'm interested in that kind of humanity, and to try to find a way to tell that to people. So hopefully we all look at the world or look at people differently next time. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Zeke and Yishan. Okay, moving on, our next wonderful student is Zaina. She's a first year in our MA in Interior Design course, born and raised in Paris. And before coming to the RCA, she actually got her bachelor's and master's degree in architecture. Over to you, Zaina.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I'm very interested in temporary spaces, movie sets, and scenography. So I was wondering, how do you choose interiors and spaces in general for your films? Do you have important criteria that you wouldn't go without for choosing a space?
It's a really interesting question, really great question, because the key thing, one of the most important things when I came to the RCA was that we were in the Stevens building, which is, you know, the one that's 2 floors on other side of the main site, not in Battersea, but in the old, what's it called? Opposite the Royal Albert Hall. And on one side, there were the film kind of directors and the producers, and then on the other side of the corridor were the production designers. So there actually was a production design course in those days. And I spent most of my time, when I could, in there, because I was learning that up until then, whenever I'd made a film at my undergraduate, essentially my parents went away, I shot a film in the house, or I borrowed my brother's car, or, you know, you'd go to film in places that you had access to that were cheap. Once I went to the RCA, then I realized, well, actually, if I had £500, we could build a set. And actually, one of the short films that I made at the Royal College of Art was a Western, a spaghetti Western that we shot in Dungeness, which is in Kent. On a beautiful sunny day. We had horses, we had cow, you know, costumes and stuff. We built a set on location, and I think we had a couple of £1,000, but we made, it was only 1 minute long, but it was the first time we did a genre film. And so the key thing was working with a designer. The key thing was having somebody who has an eye that looks at things a different way. And the earlier they start, almost at script stage, you know, why would you, then once you understand how to think of locations and sets, you never shoot in a white room. You never shoot in a square room. You always want light, you want windows, you want depth, you want layers, you want something that makes it visually more interesting, so that this element could be in focus, but this element is out of focus, but it dapples the light or it creates a shadow. You know, that all comes from kind of design and thinking. And a little bit of money goes a long way if you've got a really good collaborator. So for me, one of the best things about the RCA was working with a designer. Victoria Harwood was one of the designers I worked with in a couple of films. She came out to India. She was the person who designed our houses and our sets and found the locations. So that relationship with the designer, the cinematographer, and the director, and in that case, I was the writer and the director, the three of us were very, very close the way we worked. And I think that's a key thing. The key thing that came out of the RCA was working with a designer and actually delegating and letting the designer go away with a script and to come up with ideas, and not for me to tell the designer, this is what I want to do. I always like the idea with a composer, with an editor, the first go is yours. You go away and you come back with something and I will react. It's pointless to work with people and then to tell them this is what I want. You know, so I think that's part of the fun of collaboration, is that if you work with the right team, as you grow and trust one another, the more power you give away, the better you end up looking as a director. Because if you will find really creative people, they will always bring something that I would never have thought of.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a really interesting point. And, you know, just from the students that we've had so far, you've just had someone on interior design. We've had people on innovation design engineering, and people that are interested in making films themselves from other design courses. And we're about to have someone come up, Alice, who I'll introduce in a minute, who's doing fine arts and humanities.
Yeah.
The RCA is still across the piece. There's so many collaborative opportunities to play on the strengths of other students who are doing different things and have the skills in other things that you need. So I think that's, it's a really lovely way to work, very much the RCA ethos, I think.
The RCA ethos, but also essentially the ethos of film directing and filmmaking is it basically encompasses all of the arts. So you have writing, you have design, you have photography, you have costumes, you have, you know, photography, you have everything, post-production, you have sound, you know, music, you know, think about it. What couldn't be a part of a film? So, you know, we were working with graphic designers, we were working with people from other courses all the time when I was there. And I think that's one of the greatest things is if you are surrounded by artists, the key thing is to do your own work, but also to use that opportunity to collaborate with other artists or to learn about the subjects that you don't understand or know about. But, you know, I always wanted to learn about architecture, you know, I've always been fascinated by that. And the idea of being in the art school where you bump into people in the art bar, or you bump into people, you know, when you can, when it's safe to again, bump into fellow students and to kind of really take advantage of that. Because you never know also in the future when you might need someone who specializes in that subject.
Yeah, of course. Relationships last a lifetime if you treat them well. On that subject, Alice is our next student question, studying an MRes in Fine Arts and Humanities. She's particularly interested in the representation and interpretation of grace. Are you there, Alice?
Hello.
Hello. We can't see you. Now we can. Hi. I thought I was going to have to do your question for you then. I really wanted you to be up on the screen, so I'm glad you've joined us. Take it away, Alice.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks, Asif, for coming and for your fascinating insights. The question I had for you is, in making Senna, what was one of the biggest challenges that you faced and one of the discoveries you've made?
So the biggest challenge was something I talked about with Paul earlier, which was that when I came on, I was a hired director. The honest truth is I was probably like the 10th director they asked to do it, okay? Because I'd never even made a documentary. So everyone else that was well known in documentaries probably was asked to do it. And they all said no, thank God. Mainly because I think a lot of them didn't get it, or they didn't like sport, or they just thought, oh, well, you know, this should be about how cars are really bad for the environment. You know, it was a different kind of thing they were trying to do. I personally do love sport. I did watch Formula One when it was happening. I remember I was watching Senna's races live. I saw the last one live. I was watching it with my dad. So when I came on board, I was like, okay, for me, this is something different. I come from a drama background. I'll just do it because it'll be fun to try something else. Then what happened was, as I mentioned, there was that period where I was waiting to officially start the film, and all I could do was look at YouTube clips and do my research. And that moment was difficult, brilliant in one way, because I thought I've got an idea. I know how to direct this in a way that no one else would. But then what that means is I have to get every single person who hired me, all of the financiers, all of the producers, all of the editors, everyone, far more power than I had at that time, to believe in this concept. So the only way I could do that was to show them, keep showing them the film. And I think this was a really key changing in the way my brain worked. Up until then, I was always very protective of my work. I'd make a film, I wouldn't show it to anyone until it's finished. If I wrote a script, I wouldn't show it to anyone until it was finished. What I started doing on Senna was the only way to get people to understand what I was trying to do was to show them it as a work in progress again and again, and trust in the idea and trust in Senna to emotionally engage with the audience. And that's what happened. So it was really interesting. I had to free myself up. I had to put myself out there to say, this is imperfect, this is unfinished, it's really long. The first edit of Senna was 5 hours. We actually went to a cinema, you had to bring a packed lunch, and, and we sat in a room with a key creative crew and watched 5 hours of these clips, which are just like really technically poor. So even though people were like, this is awful, something worked, you know? There was this story there was a character, and that 5 hours became 4 hours, became 3 hours, became 2 hours, and then we had to cut it down to 90 minutes, 100 minutes in the end. That process of opening it up and showing it meant everyone eventually came on board and agreed with me in terms of how I wanted to do it. And we had to renegotiate contracts with Bernie Ecclestone, and it was not simple. But the reason why we have the film now was because I kept showing it to everybody, and people would. Senna's the only film I can think of where if we started the film with 50 people in the room, when the lights came up at the ending, there were 70 people. Where did they come from? Or if we had 100 people, there were 150 at the ending. If there were 500 people, by the ending, people were sitting in the aisles or on the floor. He drew people in. He had a charisma that just made people want to watch the film again and again. And so I knew we've got something. I know this works. I know technically I can make it look good and sound good, but I just need people to trust in the idea that I have. So that was the most important thing. I forgot your second question. What was the second one? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm a bit of a dinosaur with Zoom. And what was one of the discoveries that you made through that movie?
I suppose that was one of the discoveries was this idea of, the honest truth, I never thought I'd make a documentary again. You know, it was a one-off, right? And so that process of making a film and believing in your instincts that this film can emotionally connect with people, and that even though I'm not going to go out consciously, I'm not going to go and film people and putting interviews, a bit like what we're doing now, just go there, film someone with a bookcase behind them and say, that shot, I directed that because I'm the director of this film. Knowing that not one image in the film I shot, yet I still directed that film. That was a kind of an interesting kind of process to say, I have put this together, and the idea and the technique of putting it together, which is actually removing myself almost as a director, is what makes this film interesting and emotionally engaging. This is why I'm going to do it. And I'm going to fight for that. That, you know, if you learn to trust yourself, if you learn to trust your gut instincts, that's the most important thing, I think, about being an artist or being a creative, because hopefully if it works, then you go, well, even though I couldn't always explain it, I think I was right. I had a vision and I had an idea and I followed it through. And I think the danger of changing your mind because everyone's pressuring you, you have to find a way to express yourself. You have to find a way to fight your battles. You have to figure out when to listen, because you sometimes are wrong. I think that's all part of the process. And on Senna, it was a key moment of having a gut instinct. I was very close to being fired off that film. You know, it wasn't easy. No films are easy. But on that one, I was driving everyone crazy because I wouldn't do what I was told. But I had an idea and a vision, and I was ready to push it to the ultimate. And luckily, it worked. So I think learning to trust your gut instincts at the right time, I think, is important.
Great advice. Thank you.
Thank you,
Ali. And I think I can speak for everyone when I say I'm glad you weren't fired and that the documentaries kept on coming after then.
It's you know, it happens. You know, that's the reality of the business. You have to be a politician as much as anything. You're an artist, but you're also a politician, and you need to be as political as everyone else is in the business, because it's show business. It's not show friends, as someone said once in a film.
No, indeed. So we've got 2 more questions to come. Thank you so much for your time. Our next question comes from Dean, who's on Innovation Design Engineering. Prior to coming to the RCA, he spent a number of years working internationally as a business consultant, and during this time brought together his personal interests with postgraduate study in fine art, photography and nanotechnology.
Oh, wow.
Take it away, Dean.
Hi, Asif. Thanks very much for your time. It's great to hear your insights. And my question is, what most inspires you when choosing a subject, as in the protagonist? You kind of touched on it a little bit already, referring to their dramatic lifestyle, but then that still leaves you with a lot of choice in terms of the type of person or the actual individual. And on the same point, is there a common thread across your dramas and your documentaries? For example, in The Sheep Thief and The Far North, as in the trilogies, the lead character has both good and bad sides.
Yeah, I am really interested in, I guess, kind of anti-heroes in a way. I'm interested in people who are on the on the darker edges, or not necessarily loved, or outsiders. I think that's probably the word that I would use. It was when I was at the Royal College of Art, one of my kind of the temporary tutors who came in, a directing tutor, looked at my short films that I made previously to the RCA. And I think the first film, I made 3 films in total at the RCA. And she looked at my work, and she's the first person who said, "You've got this thing about outsiders." And I never really consciously thought about it, but I think if I look at all of them, there are people who, I'm interested in characters who are outside of the structure, the power system, or they're fighting against the structure. And essentially to a certain point win, and then they lose. And the power always wins. Now, maybe that's something that I feel subconsciously about myself, you know, as an Indian Muslim person growing up in Hackney, growing up in London, not coming from public school, not coming from, you know, in any way knowing anyone in the business. You know, I've maybe somehow have always felt like I'm sort of fighting against the system, and they're the characters that I suppose I'm attracted to. You might say there's something there. But generally, in terms of subjects, my interest is in drama and dramatic moments. Senna, the first one was Senna. Okay, Senna, I knew the ending. I went in there knowing that. The idea was to get the audience to forget the ending, but to create as much drama and key kind of emotional beats to make you almost fall in love with him. And no matter how good or bad, I'm not saying he's an angel, I'm not saying he's perfect. What's interesting is he's imperfect, and I'm interested in imperfection. Much more than perfection, imperfection and humility. And then with Senna, he had a spirituality. That was a really interesting challenge to get that across, his faith. I think the fact that my background is from my family are Muslim. I'm not particularly religious now, but I grew up with religion. That idea of faith is not something I'm against. And the Sheep Thief had magical realism. My first feature, The Warrior, had faith and spirituality and magical realism. And it was because of The Warrior that the producers asked me to make Senna, because his faith and his spirituality was a really important part of his journey and his story. And it's one of the things that I was interested in also, is how do you get that across? So in The Sheep Thief, my student film, there is this ability that the lead character has to make the sky cry, to make it rain. Now, the question is that real, or is that just like something, is he just a trickster? Is he just like, you know, he's a pickpocket, so is he just tricking people? And that idea of it raining, a good friend of mine, Irfan Khan, who was the lead actor in The Warrior, who sadly died a few months ago now, he noticed the similarity between Senna and the Sheep Thief because of rain. And in Senna, whenever Senna's in trouble, when he needs to win a race, it starts to rain. Now, this guy happens to believe in God and is very spiritual. And then you look at the film and you go, yeah, look, just when he needs it, it rains. Everyone else slows down. He goes even faster. So even though it's a documentary, there is something slightly otherworldly and magical about Ayrton Senna, which we wanted to bring out in that film. And so that each film will have something that is slightly different. Amy was different. Amy spoke her mind. She said what she thought. She was honest. She was raw. She didn't play the game. That I liked. You know, she wanted to make jazz and hip hop, and yet she got caught up as a pop star. And then everyone kind of turned on her. And I think that was interesting. The people I interviewed, the most honest voices in a way in that film, are the people that no one had ever interviewed before, her friends from before she was famous, and Nick Shymansky, that really people didn't know. And so finding the people that really know the characters that nobody else has interviewed is a big part of our research. You've got to dig deeper and do your research in a way that no one else has done before. I think that's always something that I'm trying to do. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, thank you. And yeah, I agree with the imperfection. Anton Corbijn, the photographer, said imperfection is totally underrated.
It's, you know, if you start off making films on film, then the whole thing about film is it's degrading every time you touch it or look at it or shoot it or project it. And that imperfection I like. So one of the key things on Senna was, which is really interesting. Okay, when I started making Senna, I remember the producers were saying, you know, at the time 3D was a big thing. So they were like, what we can do is we're going to get you a Formula One car and we can put a 3D camera in a Formula One car. We'll get Lewis Hamilton and he can drive around Silverstone. And I was going, oh man, I'm honestly, they're talking about shooting it in 3D with Formula One car. I'm thinking of using a lot of YouTube. You know? I'm thinking of using like a lot of stuff that is out there that looks crappy, but it's real. It's emotionally true. It's not about it being perfect and looking like 3D and technically perfect, because it's fake. right? No matter, and then what, you're going to make it look shaky afterwards? No, that footage of Senna driving around Monaco, he's all over the place, but that's why you know he's going fast, because it's the real thing, and we've got the camera from the real moment at real time, and we're going to show it to you, and it doesn't matter if it's shaky, and it doesn't matter if it's technically not right, because emotionally it works. And I think that's the key thing. You're always going for the emotion, not for perfection.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Cheers.
Thank you, Dean. And last but not least, we've got Dimitri, who's on the Information Experience Design course, the Sound Design Pathway. Dimitri is a composer, sound designer, and music technologist from Greece. And I'm delighted to welcome back Paul Thompson now to join us for this last question too. Dimitri, off to you.
Thanks, Bryony. Asif, wonderful to have you with us today. You sort of touched on my question a little bit, but I'd like to ask again in a different way. So how do you decide on hiring the right composer and for establishing the musical aesthetics in your films?
Really great, really important and really great questions, because the thing that I haven't said, and which I'm glad you're there, because it's kind of linked to the previous answer. Something may not look technically perfect in the films, but the idea is emotionally it's true, or it's honest, or it works. And there was only one moment and one shot and one point when that happened, so I like to use it. But the way you make something look better is by making it sound better. And so the sound is key, you know. So one of the main things on all of the films I've done, and this comes from my background at the RCA, working with brilliant sound designers at the RCA, one of whom I still work with, Andy Shelley, who lives down the road. He was in my class at the Royal College of Art. We worked together on The Sheep Thief, and he did Senna, he did Amy, he's done all my features. So he's my dialogue editor, and he was my initial sound designer. And so the key thing is having people who will help you elevate the story. And so on Senna, if you think about it, actually Maradona, I don't know if you see Maradona, is a good example. That footage is from the 80s. So it's actually probably the material is older than Senna and definitely older than Amy. So we've got U-matic tapes from the 80s in a football stadium with maybe 80,000 people screaming and shouting in the crowd. So if you look at those shots, you're not going to hear anything on the audio, okay? Because it was a built-in camera on a U-matic. Every single kick, every single touch, every single footstep has been put in post on Diego Maradona. Every kick, every bit of audio was designed and put in and recorded. So it's all ADR'd so that we can pick it out, so that when you're watching it, you're looking at Maradona's feet. So even when you're looking at the footage of him scoring against England in the World Cup, if you listen carefully, the goal that he scores against the shot where he kicks, that's me. Because my sound designer plays five-a-side football with me, and he came to football and he recorded us playing and he put in little shots. So like, I think I scored a free kick against Juventus as well. And another one of our friends does a handball. But that whole thing has to be created by a sound team, you know. So the idea of finding that sound team and knowing people who understand your taste, and like I said earlier, delegating and letting the sound designers go away. Very important relationship in our case between the editor, who often will start putting in sound effects, and they'll sound very clunky at the beginning, but the main thing is to tell you this is not just like taking a tape and putting it out there. It's creating hyperrealism, and you do that through sound and through music. So I've worked with two main composers over the years. I've worked with The Sheep Thief, actually was composed by someone called Dario Maranelli, who went on to work with Joe Wright and who won an Oscar for Atonement. So I've done quite a few features. He did The Warrior, and on The Warrior I was really inspired by Sergio Leone, and Sergio Leone worked with Ennio Morricone, and what he always did on his films was the music was composed before he shot the films. I don't know if you know that. So when he was shooting The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, or when he's shooting Once Upon a Time in the West, the music's already being recorded and being played on location. So when characters are walking in the climax of The Good and Bad and the Ugly, it's basically a music video. The music already exists, and he's shooting it in time to the music. He did the same with Once Upon a Time in the West. The key action scenes in Once Upon a Time in the West, the music came first. Now in Italian movies at the time were always dubbed anyway. So you could play music, have people who don't speak Italian talking, and then they'll add the dialogue afterwards of Clint Eastwood or whoever it might be, Charles Bronson. So I remember that, and I thought, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. So on The Warrior, my first feature, I asked Dario, my composer, to come out to India. And while we were shooting, I wanted him to get a feeling of India, to get a sense of the place, and so that he didn't come up with the cliches while coming up the music in Highbury in North London. I wanted him to understand what is, so while he was there, he recorded local musicians and recorded singers, and a lot of the score came out of him being on location and going off and finding local, singers and people in villages and recording the instruments and then coming back and composing it at home. So that idea of getting the texture of the place is really important. So that's one of the things I made sure was in the budget, because often if you leave it to the ending, the producers will always say there's not enough money. But if you say it early enough and you think about it ahead, then we brought the composer over. So I never use a temp score. Whenever I'm editing, I try to use the music from the composer, even if it's not right. Always don't ever fall in love with temp music. You've got to work with the composer as early as possible. I give the script to the composer so they can start coming up with themes. So often when I'm trying to raise the money, the composer will write a piece of music and then I will go off and shoot something on location, edit it together and say, this is what it's going to look like. So that process starts early. Same with the sound designer. I try and get them involved as early as possible. So what happens is that rather than having a few weeks where you just copy something that's come off temp music, you actually have months to work on the score. And that means you can get much richer and much more work in a closer way. On Senna, the main Senna theme, while we were editing, we were in North London editing. And I got a message saying, this Brazilian composer wants to talk to you. And it came via my agent, and it was Antonio Pinto. Now, Antonio Pinto had done City of God, he did Central Station, he's worked with Michael Mann, he did, what's the Tom Cruise film with Michael Mann when he's driving around in cabs? Collateral, he did Collateral, he's done quite a few really great films. So Antonio calls me up and says, I love Senna, I'm Brazilian, I'm from Sao Paulo, I watched him race, I was there, I have to do this film. So I said, look, I don't know if I can afford you, to be honest, but if you write me some music and I start editing with it, if we crack the music while we're editing, everyone will fall in love. They're going to have to hire you. And that's basically what we did, right? So he wrote the main Senna theme just purely from his memories of watching Ayrton Senna race and thinking about it. And none of that came from the footage we showed him. And then that theme I would re-edit with the editor. And it was a long piece of music, maybe 9 minutes with lots of different movements. And then we would cut it in different places, send it back to him, he'd rework it, send it back to us. And that's how we work. And so when we're editing, we might be editing for a couple of years. Antonio starts right at the beginning with some of the music that he writes with a theme. He'll record with a 4-piece orchestra. He himself is a musician. He'll record it, give it to us. We recut it, send it back. And that's how the process is. So the idea is to try and make the relationship of a much longer period, and you can get much more interesting work than if you're giving something at the last minute when we run out of money, which is invariably what happens with composers come last. And so normally it's like, you've got 2 weeks, quick, copy this. Okay. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, of course. I wish everybody worked that way, actually.
I think part of it is kind of educating collaborators to say, look, if you get me involved earlier, I can do something. But the key thing for them to understand is whatever the budget is, that is the budget. It doesn't mean you're on it full time forever. But, you don't get paid per day. You get paid because that's what the budget is for the composer or the sound designer. And you just sometimes, I like to stretch it out of a longer period of time, if you can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thanks, Dimitri. Good luck.
And on that note, that's our last question for the evening, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Asif. And also thank you to all our students that have asked such fantastic questions. I think it was an absolutely great discussion.
Yeah.
Now I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Bryony, and Asif. Thank you so much. Unbelievably generous, really, really insightful, disarmingly honest. And humble, which is always a sign of genius. Thank you so much. It really was a fascinating tour of your career and the things that have kind of made it work and the things that have perhaps not worked so well and you've kind of bounced back again. It's really, really, really very, very inspiring for all of us at the RCA to have you share your life story and your work with us. So thank you so much. We can't wait for the next film, the next work of art that will come from your stable. Thank you very much indeed.
Do you know, Paul, you just said something. I'm going to just interrupt because it was really interesting. Filmmakers often would struggle in the UK, particularly, to call themselves artists. But for me, going to the RCA made me think about it in a different way. It is a work of art. I'm working with artists. I studied at art school. Often you just feel like your job is to just be a TV director or to do something, and you're a bit embarrassed, particularly in the UK, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, for me, you're using all of the arts, and actually you are creating a work of art. Hopefully you're creating something that's going to stand the test of time and emotionally move an audience in some sort of way.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting, we were talking to a graduate from the RCA Print, who's now a very senior director at Ridley Scott Films. You know, again, she was saying how important her background as a printmaker at the RCA was, you know, before moving into very, very big.
I think I know Kai. She runs the company.
I think you might know them. Yeah. Great, Asif. Thank you so much. I hope we see you again in flesh before too long, and I hope the family film club has some good.
Still going. We watched The Third Man the other night. Brilliant.
Oh, fantastic! Because you're really getting through them, aren't you? It's Cinema Paradiso the other day. So
that's so moving. We had us all in tears.
What's next? What's next on the Kapadia?
I don't know. I need to find out. I don't know whose turn it is today. It comes down to whose turn it is in the household.
Great. Well, I hope it's a good choice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
Great.
Thanks to all the students.
Bye then.
Bye. Good luck, everyone. Bye.